All right, good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you very briefly about just a few of the amazing things that God has done in my life through His mercy. Do you have some of the images? Will come up in a minute. Okay. I grew up Roman Catholic in Louisiana with a couple of great uncles who were priests and an aunt who was a Dominican sister, and she had a big influence on the early part of my life. Next slide. I went to LSU where the first week there I met Wendy Robinson. And we went to lunch together and learned that we both loved God, cared about the environment, and wanted to become parents through adoption instead of giving birth, with the simple reasoning that if there are enough children who need parents, then we should put them at the front of the line. So Wendy went home that day and told her mother that she had met the man that God wanted her to marry. Of course, she didn't tell me this, but I kind of had a sense. Plus, she was Southern Baptist, very much not Catholic, like a real Protestant, not just an Anglican. So I kind of sensed the danger and ran the other direction. But that direction turned out to be one of loneliness and sadness. And at some point, Wendy took me to a charismatic service where I was convicted and responded to an altar call to recommit my life to Christ. So the Baptist took the Catholic to the charismatic service, and that's the way God works. I'd always understood the importance of being good, but at this point in my life, I really started to understand God's grace and my desperate need for it. So I also began to understand that what a gift of grace Wendy was, and God convicted me of what He had told Wendy on the first day that we had met. And even though it's kind of a painful chapter in our life because there were the Catholics in my life that were not very happy about us getting married, we did obey God and push our way through to a joyful wedding. So we were engaged and married, and then next slide, I guess we went to graduate school and were active in our churches. And by the time I got my PhD at 31, I was ready to have a less selfish life. So I prayed, God, help me kind of get out of myself and really get into what you want to do in my life. So next slide, God started to build our family, really, and that's, of course, a cure for selfishness. If any of you who are parents, that works pretty quickly. But for a whole year, we had a blissful year with only one child, simple life. Next slide. Then, surprise, we learned that our second daughter, Lily, needed to be adopted from a mother who had traveled to China with us, so we knew her, but for various reasons, she couldn't keep her. And so then, only 9 months after our first child, we basically had twins. And that was a lot harder. Again, parents who have two children know that too. Next slide. Also, on our trip to adopt Manna, we had met a little 11-year-old girl whom we felt God had told us was our daughter. But adopting a child who you just meet in an orphanage in China is basically impossible. But nothing's impossible with God, right? So through a contact we had in China and a lot of people's prayers, we're able to adopt Eden, who many of you know, at 13 years old, and she became the strong believer in Jesus and hard worker, is in our family today. And next slide, we adopted Shauna literally on the last day that she was eligible for adoption. So we had gone to China not knowing if we would come back with her. And the day before her 14th birthday, when she would have been cut off, that went through, and we came home with her. Once again, God had made a way, even though, and after a tough time, she came to believe in Jesus as well. So next slide. On a homecoming trip to China, to Manna and Eden's orphanage, we met a little boy named Yu Lila. And Wendy held him in her arms, turned to the same friend who had helped us adopt Eden, and said, God told me this is our son. It took like 30 seconds. So another miracle, I got a call a few months later from an adoption agency with the opportunity to adopt Lila, who you know as Asher, since the people in China had put my name on this referral, which is like never happens, and it didn't even have my phone number. It just had my Kevin. How many Kevin Robertsons are there in America? And but our family was going through a really difficult time, so we made the agonizing decision to put it off until the opportunity passed. And about 3 years later, Wendy asked me, if you had the opportunity to adopt Lila again, would you do it? And I said, yes, definitely, just to get right with God. I felt like we had been disobedient, and it was clear that we should have, and we just chickened out, basically. So the very next day, Wendy started. She called an adoption agency and said, look for his referral, and it's a real shot in the dark that they'll find this one child out of thousands. But after about 3 months, the CCAI called us and said we found his referral, and we started his adoption process immediately. And so next slide. Asher came home, and you can see how God took this one adoption, which led to another, to another, to another, and multiplied it. So now we have a quiver full of blessings. So next slide. To be sure, our family has had a lot of struggles, and Satan hates to see good things happen on this earth. But God's given us enough grace and Holy Spirit power for every day. And at this point in my life, I'm kind of in that midlife crisis phase where I'm tempted to look back and regret about ways I could have been a better parent, I could have been a better husband, could have been a better child to my parents. and wishing that I would have suffered with more faith and found more joy. But I think the most important lesson that I've learned and continuing to learn is what the Apostle Paul learned, is that it's in our weakness that we find the strength of God. And I think it's actually essential to the Christian faith that we're called to do things for which we're wholly inadequate to do, so then we experience the power of God. We certainly were not adequate to adopt teenagers at the time we did. We were not adequate to adopt a deaf child. We didn't even know sign language. We definitely weren't financially adequate, but by our third adoption, we learned that you just start the process and God just rains money down from heaven. It's crazy. It's true. But that's what God does. And final slide. One of the most meaningful historic sites on our Israel trip that we just got back from a couple weeks ago was, oddly enough, a huge pile of these beautifully carved granite blocks from Herod the Great's temple, lying right where the Romans had dumped them off the Temple Mount after they destroyed Jerusalem in AD 60. So the disciples, it's recorded in the Gospels, were amazed by the size of the stones. And then Jesus said, if you destroy this temple, I will rebuild it in 3 days. And I thought, that's my life. This beautiful temple built to my own glory, just destroyed and replaced by the risen Christ. Amen. And I thought, the messes of my life now, they may never be rebuilt, but I have the eternal grace of a victorious Jesus. And that's more than enough for a life of great joy. Thanks again.